Hi, everybody. I'm Bob Bowman, Editor-in-Chief of Supply Chain Brain. I want to welcome you to this presentation on the need for building a resilient supply chain organization presented by Deloitte. One quick note, there will be an audience question and answer session at the end of this presentation. Audience members are encouraged to submit their questions at any time during the presentation by clicking on that Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. Now, disruptions, past, present, and future, make it essential to build resilience into supply chain organizations. To do that, many companies are investing in new technology and business models with a focus on advanced analytics. But to be truly sustainable, resilience has to be embedded into the DNA of an organization. And that requires building a connected workforce ecosystem that includes talent, skills, and the ability to adapt to new ways of working. So today, we're going to learn about what it takes to align a workforce ecosystem strategy with the supply chain and understand supply chain's leadership role in building a resilient organization. With that, I want to introduce our speakers for today. Deborah Neff is a principal in Deloitte's human capital practice. She has nearly 20 years of experience in advising global companies on organizational strategy. Deb leads Deloitte's human capital supply chain strategic growth offering, taking clients through the development of new operating models and the identification of critical talent for and future-proofing teams and organizations. Dasha Streit is manager of human capital with Deloitte. She specializes in leading data-driven change management programs as part of large-scale supply chain transformation initiatives. With more than 16 years of experience in supply chain and logistics projects, Dasha leads Deloitte's Human Capital Supply Chain Strategic Growth Offering Core Services team. So with that, I want to turn it over to Deb. Deb Neff, take it away.
Thank you, Bob, and hello to our participants. Dasha and I are looking forward to the discussion today. We want to start with a poll by getting an understanding of what resiliency means to you.
All right, well, let's see what this poll is asking. We want the audience to tell us exactly what does resilience mean to you? Define it in your estimation. So here's 4 choices for you. A, innovate, continually evolve to stay ahead of the curve. B, flexibility, the ability to respond and adapt. C, stability during times of disruption. Or D, all of the above. So pick whatever you think best fits your feeling or your definition of the word resiliency. We'll give you a few seconds to answer, and then we'll see what everybody has to say. Obviously, this is a question on everyone's minds these days, but it's certainly possible that people have different ideas about what they all mean. So let's see what the audience said here. Okay, so we're starting at 81% says all of the above. I can't say I'm that surprised to hear them say that. But 19% said flexibility or the ability to respond and adapt. And then equally, nobody said only innovate, continually evolve to stay ahead of the curve, or stability during times of disruption. So there you go. There's a good level set for you, Deb. Take it away with that knowledge, and we'll see what we have to say about that. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Bob. And so, audience, this was not a trick question. It was actually intended as a level set for us to recognize that resiliency encompasses a lot of things. So yes, it was D, all of the above. And so what this means is resiliency is about evolution and continually adapting to stay ahead, but it's also having the ability to respond and recover from setbacks. And my favorite for resiliency, because it's a bit of a mind tease, is the idea of building flexibility into your organization so that you have the stability in times of disruption. Of course, resiliency has always been a critical enabler of survival, but it was spoken about more in terms of adapting, as we saw from about 19%, right, of those votes, resiliency meaning adaptation. So yes, resiliency has been a critical enabler of survival, but it was spoken about in terms of adapting to a new way of being, rather than also the ability to bounce back. And so what we're seeing as in resiliency taking on more importance is because of that idea to stay competitive, to stay relevant. You can't just survive through adaptation. That takes a long time. You also need to be building in the ability to recover when there's an unexpected event. These unexpected events are increasing in frequency. And so let's move on to the next slide. Because we have several macro forces that are at play and contributing to these unexpected, uncontrollable events. So these macro forces, they're broad and they're varied. They range from geopolitical instability to cybersecurity risks, to talent skills and shortages. And all of these are bigger than any one organization, let alone any one supply chain function can affect. And so it's no longer about trying to avoid these forces, but instead recognizing the inevitability of these forces and preparing your supply chain to operate with the unexpected. We've all heard the phrase, change is the new normal. In fact, we're probably tired of hearing that a little bit. It certainly became cliche during COVID. Well, what I'm starting to say to my clients now is that expecting the unexpected is the new way of working. So what does this mean for supply chains? Leaders are responding to this disruption in many ways. We hear 92% of leaders saying that they're going to be adopting new business models to operate more responsively. Half are saying they're going to expand their ecosystem of partners to diversify and increase their ability to be responsive to market shifts, and in fact, be more resilient. What's interesting is that while technology is an enabler to resilience, and we recognize, right, a lot of companies are taking on some sort of technological or digital transformation, that in and of itself is not a solve, because 66% of the jobs within the workforce are going to require a different skill set to operate and work with this new technology. But what's clear from this view of all these statistics is that leaders across industries are recognizing that resiliency is critical and requires new ways of working, new capabilities, and new types of talent. So let's break down this concept of resiliency into a few organizational components. So first, the supply chain itself, which is what you see here in the graphic on the right. As a function, supply chain has gone through its own evolution from operating as a linear, sequential organization to a continuous, connected ring. And what you see here on the right are the different nodes of a supply chain, starting with product development to synchronized planning, smart operations, dynamic fulfillment, and customer support. And let's be honest, supply chains for years have acknowledged the need and the importance of breaking down these functional silos between these teams and operating in a more connected way. But now we're seeing a bigger emphasis on particularly the importance of responsiveness, not just being connected, but being able to respond quickly and having the data that is accessible real time to not only be reactive, but to be predictive and proactive. So diversification and localization is also becoming super important. We're seeing supply chains recognize the importance of creating strategic partnerships and putting production closer to the customer. Later on, Dasha and I are going to share some examples of what this looks like when a supply chain takes on a transformation to become more resilient. Can you imagine the competitive advantage a supply chain creates when all of these pieces on the right are connected and operating with the characteristics that are outlined on the left? So let's take a look at how we get this connectedness. The characteristics of a resilient supply chain are centered on what we would call a digital core. That's the connective tissue across all the nodes of a supply chain. And there are three important things here that I want to call your attention to. First, a digital core enables information sharing through a connected platform. So this means, and this is more technology speak than I normally do, but this means an integrated data architecture that allows for information flows in real time between systems. So for example, demand signals in planning are flowing through to fulfillment teams needing to make decisions about inventory allocation real time. A connected platform also means the ability to bring together cross-functional data between finance, marketing, and sales to respond, for example, to a successful promotion that's happening in a certain region. And of course, a connected platform is only as useful as the data. So second on this list is centralized data that serves up information in a consistent way so that all parties in that connected supply chain have access to the same information. And finally, what you see here is the ability for automation and insights that come from having a digital core. And what's most interesting, I think, about the digital core is that the data and the integrated technology and data architecture is all table stakes. The more data you put in, the more scenarios you run, the smarter your digital core becomes, the more predictive and more insights you're able to draw from it. For example, Dasha and I, in the space that we're working in, are seeing a real uptick in planning technologies right now. And that means, that organizations and their employees are having to move from working in disconnected manual spreadsheets to real-time scenario planning using technology. And with these technologies, we're seeing dashboards from integrated control towers that can send alerts to help with rerouting inventory or production based on capacity constraints or other supply chain disruptors. I can't tell you how many times I have worked with companies who struggle to have their finance, their sales, their planning data in a way that rolls up information in one consistent view across the organization. An integrated digital core increases the visibility, increases the consistency, increases the collaboration. In short, a digital core is a critical enabler of building a resilient supply chain. So this connected, data-driven supply chain sounds great, but its success is all predicated on a workforce that can be engaged and knows how to operate in this dynamic environment. And so the third component of a resilient supply chain is about the workforce, not just your own workforce, but about expanding the aperture and considering the full ecosystem of available workers. You can see in the outer ring of the graphic on the right that the workforce ecosystem is made up of both the traditional employees within your own company, but also includes seasonal workers, third-party logistics, suppliers, and even an alternative workforce, which is recognition that robots are now a legitimate contributor in the workforce. I was talking to a CHRO of a major consumer products company recently, and he was quoted saying, "Managing a workforce ecosystem is one of the holy grails to drive productivity for growth in the future." And in a global survey done by Deloitte, 93% of managers in companies around the world count some external workers to be part of their workforce. An example many of you may be familiar with is when Amazon built its transportation division, Amazon Logistics. The company didn't hire its own drivers. Instead, it formed partnerships with independent delivery companies. Amazon was following a playbook that many companies are starting to deploy, which is using networks of small partners to provide critical workforce contributors. In other words, looking at all these groups as potential sources of talent and support towards your organizational goals is one step closer to building in resiliency. So how do you think about this broad concept of a workforce ecosystem and managing it as one cohesive group? It comes down to thinking about it as orchestration. Just as when an orchestra is playing a song, instruments fade in and fade out at different times, so too can a workforce within the ecosystem. That flexibility to come in and come out is where the power is for an organization. To have the network and the management practices in place to tap into various worker types at expected and unexpected moments is what makes a workforce ecosystem a critical part of a resilient supply chain. More specifically, when you begin to think about real-time dynamic operations, access to on-demand skills becomes a super interesting proposition, right? Or consider ways in which you can strengthen partnerships with your supplier through a trusted supplier program, for example. That way, when there's an unexpected increase in demand, as there was for one of my retail clients, when consumers wanted more pink apparel after the release of the Barbie movie this past summer, you have a built-in network to tap into to expedite production. With a more expansive view of your workforce and the practices to engage them, you unlock a responsiveness and a resiliency that will be a strategic differentiator for you. So how do you bring all these pieces together? A digital core, your supply chain, a workforce ecosystem to drive resiliency? It comes together through 4 components. Now, the sequence of these components is intentional. And while it doesn't have to be top-down or linear, you can start anywhere. There's an implied alignment and reinforcement with the item above in place. And so let me explain. Of course, it starts with strategy, both your company strategy and your organizational strategy. Where are you trying to go? What are you trying to achieve? What is your organization's purpose? Then you think about the organizational capabilities or the operating model that will enable you to execute against that strategy. Do you have the right capabilities? Are there new capabilities you need to mature, or some capabilities you may need to retire? Are you strategically aligning your global and your regional capabilities, or thinking about centralization and localization in the right way? For this component, an exercise I often do with clients is to segment their capabilities into those that are strategic, like real marketplace differentiators, those that are core, which are important to be competitive, and those that are foundational. They're needed, but they're not differentiating. This segmentation then leads into an assessment of your structure and your talent. How are you structuring your organization? What are the roles and the talent you need? How are you organizing yourself for faster decision-making and responsiveness, for example? And what's interesting here is that it's not just structural changes. We're seeing organizations really invest in the work to define clear roles, clear responsibilities, and decision rights. Doing what I call a water through the pipes practice to really bring to life the handoffs and understand where bottlenecks may occur in the system. And talent, as we discussed on the previous slide, this is taking on much more strategic importance and encompasses a broader view of talent than just who is inside your organization. Finally, change management. While it's listed as a standalone component at the end, it should be viewed as the backbone that all these other pieces hang off of. Change management is no longer viewed as a point-in-time activity, but actually a way of working. So let me give a quick example to bring all this together, and then I'll hand over to Dasha to get into this even a little bit more specifically. I was working for an organization years ago whose enterprise strategy was focused on speed, innovation, and a shift to more direct-to-consumer sales. To drive speed and their focus on DTC, forecasting, inventory management, and inventory positioning became strategic capabilities that they wanted to invest in. When we looked at their org structure, we looked for ways to flatten that structure and empower workers closer to the customer to increase that responsiveness. And to execute and operate, this company put a real focus on talent with deep analytical and decision-making skills. And finally, the change management in this client example I'm sharing was really focused on cultural changes in how they worked. They felt that a majority of their go-to-market challenges was due to insufficient cross-functional and cross-channel collaboration. So improving how the team worked together and understanding each other's roles became really critical to their strategic goal of speed. Later on, I'll enhance this example with some more specifics. But for now, I'm going to hand over to Dasha to do another poll.
Actually, we could bring Dasha in certainly, but let's do this. Let's bring up this second poll first and see what everybody has to say about what Deb just told us about. The question for our audience now is, where is your organization focusing today? And the choices we give you are based on the components that you just heard Deb tell us about. So tell us where your focus is right now. Is it A, strategy? Is it B, capabilities? Is it C, structure and talent? Is it D, transformation and change? Or finally, your choice of E, not applicable, our focus is elsewhere. Okay, let's hope not. Anyway, so audience, just give us a sense of which of those major components that Deb was telling us about is your focus at the moment. We'll give you a few seconds to respond, and we'll get some real insight here into where people are on this, because certainly I have a feeling that a lot of companies are not very well They're not very advanced, certainly on all of those aspects. Okay, so here we go. We're going to say the leading off at 44%, we have transformation and change, followed by 27% say strategy is their focus. 15% say capabilities, 12% say structure and talent, and finally, just 2% say not applicable. Our focus is elsewhere. How interesting. Okay, so at this point then, I would like to turn it over to Dasha Streit, who's going to pick up this point of the presentation. Dasha, take it away.
Thanks, Bob. Keeping your poll answers in mind, let's talk a little bit more about what this looks like in practice and bring it to life a little. We recognize that every organization is in a different part of their journey, and areas of focus can differ based on several factors. Deb provided a great overview of how it all comes together. So let's take a deeper dive into the purpose of each and talk about some questions you can start thinking about to help your organizations drive decisions around these dimensions. You don't necessarily have to start at the top of the list and work your way down, but wherever you do start, you need to be clear about where you're headed. From the poll results, it looks like a lot of people focus on transformation and change, and then strategy. Strategy is a great starting point to help define the work and drive overall vision. When it comes to supply chain strategy's purpose, it's important to make sure there's alignment between it and the enterprise-wide priorities. We aren't suggesting you reset your strategy, but rather take a self-assessment of your workforce strategies and look and see if they're aligned to your organizational strategies. You can always make adjustments if needed. If we look across from strategy to the questions on the right, ask yourself, what do you think supply chain's role is in activating your overall organizational strategy? I'll take a second for you to think about it. One client I was working with was part of a global distribution team with a newly launched product organization. Part of the overall supply chain vision was to have a seamless, omni-channel distribution network. Tying to the broader vision, this distribution leader set out a strategy for her team. It really focused on launching new distribution tools, like a cloud-based WMS system, to help her team shift with the market. Focusing on dexterity and agility, one of the words Deb talked about earlier, was also delivering results. You can now see how the two strategies align and tie back to our key themes of what makes a resilient supply chain organization. If we move down to capabilities and bring them into focus, capabilities are how we organize the work, or what we call an operating model. It helps organizations look at how your people, process, and technology all come together, and where the work is being done within your organizations. Ask yourself, how will our current operating structure support our desired capabilities? Are there areas within your organization to create efficiencies or improve ways of working through shared services models? A new trend we're seeing with our clients is looking at capabilities that can be shared across supply chain functions. Think of portfolio management, strategy, data and analytics, or change management. These functions enable organizations to break down silos and create more cross-functional collaborations, both two key characteristics of helping supply chains with their resiliency maturity. Next, let's dive deeper into one of the people components, structure and talent. If organizational strategies and capabilities are shifting, then it makes sense that talent needs also need to shift to maintain a balance and align organizational changes. If you look at the two questions on the right, how will our organizational structure support the model? And how will supply chain jobs shift if we're looking at future skills needs? I'd like to share an example from one of my colleagues. He had a client that was implementing a new procurement tool. At this time, procurement was handled by individual warehouses, and there wasn't a centralized procurement function or a dedicated team in place to handle the responsibilities. He shared, and this proved to be extremely problematic when the technology went live, but funny enough, there wasn't a team in place to use the tool. So this might seem like an unusual experience, But have any teams in place you know of been so tech focused that they almost forgot one of the important parts is having the people in place and trained with the right skill sets in order to deliver value to the business. It also helps with being adaptable. The most respondents replied that their organizations are focusing on transformation and change. Although we're focusing on it last here, it's really important to remember that this is the thread that pulls everything together. It's really, how do we get from here to there? By activating everything that we just talked about. There certainly are many flavors of change management and how it's integrated into transformation. Organizations are evolving from thinking about a point-in-time change to embedding change management into their organizational DNA. This can be done by developing a change readiness mindset, which helps organizations better prepare, withstand, or bounce back from disruption. Throughout transformations, we can ask ourselves, what role do we expect our supply chain leaders to play in leading the transition? This can be you or other leaders within your organizations. But supply chain leaders should be some of the biggest cheerleaders on the team. Lack of leadership alignment and change management are often why initiatives don't reach their full potential. I've found that embedding change engagement and leadership alignment initiatives into my strategic planning for my clients helps transformational programs become more successful in achieving desired outcomes. It's important to remember there's not a one-size-fits-all approach, and it doesn't have to be perfect. The most important thing is to have a solid foundation to build upon and have a place, be able to focus on continuous and ongoing improvement. So let's take a look now about what that looks like in practice and see how it comes together through the lens of one of our clients. This client's organization was going through a truly transformational change. They were focusing on everything all at once. They were redefining their strategy. They were building capabilities. They were focusing on several priority process and technology initiatives all at the same time, while also developing their future workforce needs and change management strategy. I don't know about you, but it seems overwhelming and a lot. But this global packaging manufacturing company, with a workforce of over 50,000 globally, had mostly grown by acquisition. So if you can picture hundreds of facilities all around the world with disaggregated processes, different technology systems, disparate planning, and discrete cultures, bringing everything together would probably have needed to be addressed eventually. But like many stories we hear, COVID accelerated the timeline and leadership recognized that they needed to change to better serve their customers and build more resiliency to withstand future market disruptions. Achieving this strategy meant also shifting the whole business model, moving from decentralized to a centralized operating model with impacts across people, process, and technology. This client tackled the transformation in 4 phases. Obviously, you need to figure out how to break it down, and they took a 4-phased approach. Phase 1 focused on setting initial foundation, standing up a new supply chain organization. It included setting the supply chain vision and strategy, as supply chain didn't exist in their previous models. They defined organizational structures and new operating models. Phase 1 also launched a huge development of a new centralized digital core in an ERP system for the entire organization. Phase 2 focused on expanding and deepening areas and capabilities within the functions themselves. It included activating new organizations and bringing together the whole supply chain network under one umbrella. Existing sourcing, procurement, manufacturing, and fulfillment teams were all centralized in the new supply chain network. A gap was identified that the organization did not have a traditional planning function, and so they needed to not only centralize it, but build it as bits and pieces were held within other sub-functions. One of the initiatives was bringing together pieces from the finance team, for example, to build out a demand planning organization in order to have proper forecasting, in order to plan for their inventory. Phase 3 focused on identifying capabilities and tools along with skills gaps for the new organization. Initiatives included identifying the right technology and designing the new supply chain planning platforms, developing an integrated roadmap so leaders could see all of the impacts across all of the functions in one place, aligning leadership changes, initiatives, and workforce needs built into a workforce enablement roadmap aligned to the overall integrated roadmap. They also continue to refine processes, tools, and capabilities. They identified areas of opportunity also to create shared services models. Finally, moving into phase 4, they focused on activating all of the planned initiatives in order to deliver value to the business. Those initiatives included implementing foundational capabilities of the new tools and technology, executing overarching tactical change management, training the organization around change readiness, facilitating leadership alignment activities, and assessing workforce strategy needs in collaboration with HR business partners. So what was the outcome of this transformation? It seems like a lot to take on. Through defining their new strategy, building new capabilities, and focusing on talent and change initiatives, including leadership alignment and cross-functional collaboration, this client was able to navigate significant organizational shifts in people, process, and technology, achieving their transformational objectives. They're well on their way to prove their business case, such as improving OTIF, increasing inventory accuracy, and evolving their digital core and network connectivity. They are also investing in their future workforce by identifying future skills needs and building a change readiness mindset, embedding resiliency to better withstand future disruption. So how can you help your organization go on a similar journey? I'll turn it back over to Deb to talk about where you can start.
Thanks, Dasha. I want to acknowledge that what we've outlined in this presentation is certainly an ideal state, and we certainly recognize that it may feel very aspirational. But building resiliency into your organization can be both transformational, as in the case study that Dasha just shared, or it can start with incremental steps, as in some of the examples I shared earlier. Ultimately, resiliency requires the fundamentals of data, connectedness, the right talent and partners, and a way of working that supports such fluidity. But organizations can start this journey in pockets and build the capability over time. And you can start in any of these places, as long as you're always clear on where you're going and that your efforts are in alignment and in service of your enterprise and organizational strategy.
Well, thank you very much for that, both of you, Deb and Dasha, for that great presentation. My goodness, that's a lot of information to absorb, and a lot of marching orders for companies out there that are seeking to achieve these kind of improvements in their supply chain. I want to take a little time, though, to ask the two of you some questions before we get to the actual audience question and answers portion of our presentation. And let me start by asking you, Deb, to kind of clarify for us, what are some important considerations when actually building a resilient global supply chain?
Thanks, Bob. So we really see the global element becoming an important factor when thinking about ways of working or the interaction models and handoffs between teams. We talked a lot, Dasha and I both talked about connectedness and cross-functional collaboration. So thinking about things as simple as time zones can be really important, but then things that are more complicated, like local regulations around talent, cultural norms around decision-making and empowerment. These are all considerations when thinking about how to build resiliency in your organization at scale. So the best way to manage through this is by ensuring that you have the right representation and experiences on your team. We always recommend that clients who are undertaking projects plan for regional representation, even if the focus of a particular piece of work is on one region. We also recommend that clients start piloting initiatives. We're real advocates of an MVP approach. I have a client that refers to it as kind of execute, check, and adjust. This is also another way to start building in a culture of change and a comfort with executing without all the perfect information, which is needed if you're going to truly be a resilient organization. So of course, we're seeing global companies really focusing on blueprints and standardization where possible, but making sure they're building in the ability to collect that feedback and allow for the regional teams to fill in the edges.
Interesting balance you're talking about striking there. For all the importance of integration, there's still going to be some local control that's going to be needed based on the peculiarities of each part of the globe that makes up a supply chain. Thank you for that. So Dasha, what do you see as an underestimated characteristic of resilient supply chains?
Thanks, Bob. I think we covered a lot so far today, but if I had to pick one, I think an underestimated characteristic of resilient supply chain would be adaptability of the workforce ecosystem. Being able to continuously evolve, quickly adjust and adapt to the shifting expectations due to uncontrollable internal or external disruptors. And in many cases, I think leaders tend to focus on there being one path, right? Versus when there are a variety of different options or different pilots, as Deb just spoke about, that you could run to see what works. And using those variety of journeys, there are trade-offs of the implications. So I think being adaptable while maintaining focus and working with the end state in mind really enables a better experience for leaders and the workforce in order to stay adaptable, to kind of go with the flow.
Yeah, adaptable is certainly an important part of any organization, but I don't think humans are necessarily that adaptable either. So they have that. It definitely has to be taken into consideration, the individuals within your workforce and their ability to adapt and your ability to get them to do that. So Deb, as you are working with organizations and building resilient supply chains, how are you seeing talent needs shift? And this is a big question because this in the last year or two with the emergence of technology and AI, that's one big trigger. Tell us in a larger sense how you see that.
Yeah, we're definitely seeing huge shifts in talent needs. So there's three trends that we're seeing. First, it's how organizations are hiring talent to begin with. The way it has traditionally worked is that leaders and recruiters would define roles and then fill those roles by posting job openings and then evaluating the talent based on minimum qualifications such as experience and education and certification. But now with the talent shortage and the need for speed and responsiveness and the need for really specific skills, we're seeing organizations take a shift to what we're calling skills-based hiring, which is focused on evaluating talent based on a specific set of skills and behavior and de-emphasizing credentials like education or time in role. So with the skills-based approach, this allows organizations to be able to access the skills and the talent more quickly. And then in some cases, they can, employees are deciding that they want to hire for a specific skill and then do on the job training for anything else that's going to be needed to help an employee perform on the job. This approach is allowing companies to access a larger and more diverse pool of candidates, as you can imagine. Mm-hmm. So the second trend that we're seeing around talent is skills themselves and how they're being defined and where there's focus. There's a real emphasis, as I'm sure our audience was able to discern from the discussion, on data and analytics, but also how to interpret the data and really understand what the data means, both upstream and downstream. It's no longer just about understanding what a metric means in your particular area, but really being able to think bigger picture and understand the connectivity. So for example, we might have seen a job posting for a planner in the past that would focus on a comfort with Excel or ability to write macros and manage issues. But today we'd see a posting focusing on skills such as predictive analytics, developing insights, identification of continuous improvement. And another skill, which I'll talk about as the third trend, but storytelling. And so that is the third trend. This focus on human and soft skills are taking a greater importance in all roles. So again, that example of the planner, which is historically more analytical, even storytelling and how they're able to take those insights and stitch together a narrative is becoming something we're seeing very important. In addition to soft skills, empathy and leading with empathy, being comfortable with ambiguity, and the ability to influence. All of these are what we're calling human skills that we're seeing is really important in talent of the future. And finally, I would be remiss if I didn't again mention that the very definition of talent, as I laid out earlier, is more expansive. We're not just talking about talent within our own company, within our own four walls of our organization, but we're discussing and thinking about a workforce ecosystem and talent that is both human and machine. You mentioned AI earlier. So it's thinking about talent in terms of the internal, the external, and the technology partners.
I love your emphasis on storytelling, Deb. That's not something I've heard a lot before. So that's a really interesting insight to walk away with. Thanks for that. So Dasha, everything you laid out here makes sense, obviously. How, in your mind, should organizations be thinking about where to start? How should they prioritize their workforce needs?
One helpful way we like to approach this is we call it zoom out, zoom in, or taking a big picture approach and then really honing in on workforce and skills needs. So at first you zoom out, we can explore what's possible. We can consider the components we reviewed today, like strategy, capabilities, structure and talent, and the transformation and change. We can take stock of what's best in class in the market using benchmarks and begin to consider whether or not these might work for your organization. It's important to know what's out there to be able to hone in on your own needs. So then we suggest you zoom in. This will allow you to assess where your organization is today, identifying where there are skills and gaps, and then define the importance and impact of addressing and how to start building an actual plan to close those gaps. It's okay to start small and fill gaps as you mature in your journey, letting the work help prioritize your workforce needs. Let's take the example of talent to make this real. When our clients are thinking about prioritizing their workforce needs, many of them are zooming out using increasingly available data on hot skills in the market to inform their future competency models. We see those same clients also zooming in using performing skills assessments to determine where there are skill gaps within their workforce. The result is an understanding of the skills of the future and the current skill gaps that organizations can use to plan their talent strategy.
Thanks for that, Dasha. At this point, I want to bring our audience in with their own questions. We do have quite a few of them already lined up for our speakers to answer, but even as we are answering those questions, audience members are encouraged to continue to submit questions, and we'll get to as many of those as we can, time permitting. So let me start with this one for Deb, and maybe Dasha can chime in if she wants to after that. In terms of organizations applying these concepts we've discussed, what are some examples of quote unquote good from your perspective?
I mentioned earlier an example of a client who refreshed their strategy, and it was focused on speed, innovation, and a focus on direct to consumer. What was so good about this client was that they did start kind of at the beginning. They took that strategy of speed and innovation and direct to consumer and really started by evaluating their own capabilities. So this organization was a transportation function. And for the first time, transportation was being viewed as a strategic lever for that speed and that direct to consumer capability. So building resiliency was an opportunity to step back and take a current state assessment. They looked at where they were lagging. They laid out a roadmap for how they would incubate, grow, and phase capabilities into their organization instead of creating a lot of disruption at once. And so I know Dasha and I have both acknowledged that what we're laying out here, taken in the aggregate may seem overwhelming, but it can be parsed and paced and phased over time in a way to be strategically that can be strategically absorbed by the organization and not create a lot of disruption at once. So this company first started by doing that current state assessment and understanding where they were lagging, where they wanted to prioritize a focus. And then they evaluated their talent, and they took a real look at who they had on their team and where they needed to invest in building up skills or hiring in new skills to close gaps. And next, they did an exercise, and this is going to probably make many of you groan, but it may have been the single most effective piece of work that they did together. And that is this transportation team spent time developing RACIs, the responsible, accountable, consulted, informed matrix. And they did this not only within their own team, but also with their adjacent cross-functional teams to clarify and communicate the roles, the responsibilities, and the decision rights. And this RACI work was not easy, but it's actually what helped them really articulate their work and their roles and how they were going to work in a more connected, cross-functional way. And ultimately, this clarity is what helped support their speed, right, and their ability to be responsive to the market. Dasha, I think you have an example too of a client.
Yeah, something popped in my mind. A lot of times I think, Deb, our clients focus on KPIs or what value they're driving to the business. But I thought this was a really interesting example from one of our clients, because their strategy, part of it was focusing on employee safety and well-being as one of their outcomes. And so it was a vertically integrated materials company, and they set out to implement a synchronized planning tool with production planning. But the focus on safety and well-being was interesting to me because with greater insights into their planning and production scheduling, the organization was able to achieve their goal of improving safety and job satisfaction. The production accuracy that they found in the implementation and knowing how much they needed to produce and when, they were able to properly plan shifts, which helped decrease overtime for the company. So it drove the cost savings, but it also reduced worker fatigue, which they found resulted in less truck and equipment accidents on site and drove better work-life balances. So I thought that was an interesting example, kind of different than what we usually think of as we're looking of like what good looks like or what can you work for.
Certainly. Thank you for that. Okay, this question is, and it kind of dovetails a little bit with what you guys were just talking about, and I'm going to direct it to Deb. What is leadership's role in building a resilient supply chain? How does it all happen from the top?
Yeah, well, of course, leaders set the tone, and they need to be the orchestrators. And this orchestration means not only understanding how to tap into the broader workforce ecosystem, which we talked about earlier, but building partnerships and relationships and really thinking about how to allocate work for internal and external contributors. So admittedly, the idea of accessing a workforce ecosystem is still nascent, and organizations are still experimenting with what the right allocation of work between internal, external, and even where to tap into robotics and machines. All of this is still, I think, being experimented with right now. But the clear, important element of leadership is not just that ecosystem and accessing the workforce, but the ability to lead through what I call wicked problems. And a wicked problem is one that is so complex that it requires multiple domains of expertise. And so you're hearing Dasha and I continue to talk about cross-functional collaboration, connectiveness. The leader is really at the heart of all of this orchestration, and they need to be comfortable reaching out and identifying the various areas of expertise that's going to be needed to coalesce a team to solve a problem. Those macro forces I talked about at the beginning, the problems that we're facing today, the need to be so responsive to market demands requires not just one area of expertise anymore, but a multitude of experience. And so the role of a leader in a resilient supply chain is really being comfortable not having all the answers themselves and understanding where to tap into and how to orchestrate a team around them. So being a resilient supply chain means putting leaders in the center and empowering them to model that cross-functional collaboration.
Great. This question acknowledges what you referenced earlier in the presentation, that most organizations are experiencing talent shortage, where demand is outpacing supply. How are you seeing them address this gap? Dasha?
Well, it wouldn't be a good supply chain presentation if we weren't addressing supply and demand gaps, but we're talking about talent here, right? So
the supply chain for the supply chain, right?
Exactly. Well, it makes a lot of sense. So
Yeah.
I think there's misalignment in talent between what we see as market demand and then the supply that are meeting organizational needs, which is, encouraging organizations to explore new ways to identify and get creative around accessing and finding talent they need. Under traditional models, I think organizations would address talent gaps by just hiring full-time employees. But I think the trend and how we're evolving is seeing organizations embrace a more holistic workforce ecosystem. Think about the diagram or the picture Deb shared earlier with the circle and all of those that go around it. I think it's also not focusing on, your full-time or part-time employees, but think about contingent workers, freelancers, contractors, gig economy, or looking beyond humans to even consider robotics and machines as part of your workforce. I think this broader view can help us deliver work, and organizations can make their workforces more flexible and elastic, which we tend to see as more scalable. In addition, to access new talent models, we're seeing organizations consider their employee value proposition. They rethinking their workforce experience to ensure they can capture that talent that they seek. When we know when organizations better understand their workers and their workforce needs, they can better meet them to grow and retain them.
This question says, considering the evolving nature of disruptions, can you please elaborate on what are some of the biggest challenges in building a resilient supply chain? Deb?
Yeah, so there are two common pitfalls that I would call out when talking about building a resilient supply chain. The first is just resistance to change, which Bob, you acknowledged earlier,
That's right,
that humans aren't very adaptable by nature. But this, again, kind of tying back to my answer earlier about the role of the leader and their opportunity to role model. Building resiliency into an organization is hard and does require change. And so it does need to start at this top, and it needs to no longer be viewed as a point in time, but actually a mindset. And you heard us earlier talk about kind of embedding it into the organizational DNA of a company. Change, right, and adaptability and resiliency needs to just be part of the way work is done. So mitigating that resistance is pitfall number one. The other pitfall that we see is misalignment between teams. And, I gave the example a moment ago about the pretty tactical piece of work I did with the client around building races. And I joked, right, that many of you were probably groaning, and it was time consuming, but it's what created the alignment, right? It opened up the conversation, and it created some really important clarity between teams on roles and decision rights. And that clarity, of course, is what enables a team and an organization to operate quickly when they need to. And so I think those are two pitfalls that we see.
Well, I have to be the deliverer of bad news, and that is that we are just about out of time. I could hear you two of you talk about this and answer questions for hours, but that's not going to happen. So thank you so much, both of you. We have time for just one final question, and I'm going to shoot it over to Deb. So it's obvious you're very passionate about this topic. I would agree about that. Based on what you've learned, based on what our listeners and viewers have learned over the last hour, what should they be doing next in order to put all this information and insight into action?
All right, well, I'll start with how I did at the beginning. the idea of building resiliency into your organization encompasses a lot of pieces. And so Dasha and I talked about strategy and capabilities, talent, and organizational change management. But if you had to put one thing in action from the discussion today, it would be widening your aperture and really considering the broader workforce ecosystem in which your organization is operating. While you need the connectiveness between the supply chain functions, which we outlined at the beginning, and that digital core, which enables the data and the visibility, you're going to need a workforce who can operate in this dynamic environment. Dasha's story of a client that implemented a technology and then forgot that they hadn't spent any time thinking about their team is a good warning for all of us.
Darn it, forgot the people.
That's right.
Yeah.
So your one thing, consider your workforce. Think about how you can take a skills-based approach to your talent, how you can build strategic partnerships, and how you can access on-demand skills at different times. I'll remind you of the image of an orchestra I shared earlier. Think of yourself as the conductor. Every part of your supply chain organization needs to be participating and thinking about resiliency. And at its core, resiliency is about working together, problem solving, and accessing what you need when you need it. So my excitement comes from the fact that building resiliency into an organization is a place that supply chain functions can lead. All over, we're seeing supply chains become strategic differentiators for organizations, and a resilient supply chain becomes a superpower for an organization. So building the superpower into an organization, positioning that organization to operate from a place of strength, I think that's pretty exciting work.
Well, Deb and Dasha, it sounds like you've done an awful lot to provide us with the tools to acquire those superpowers to create a truly resilient supply chain and all the considerations that need to be taken into account. So I want to thank you, Deb Neff and Dasha Streit, so much for those great insights, as well as thanking our audience for your participation as well. So, hey, stay tuned for the next episode, episode 4 in this great series from Deloitte. That'll be March 27th, 2024 at 2 p.m. ET. The theme will be legal and regulatory compliance and governance in supply chain management. There is the URL. You needn't try to frantically copy it down. This information will be provided to all listeners and viewers of this webinar offline afterwards. So again, thanks everybody for participating. Thanks for that great information and insight. Everybody, have a great day.